Thank you very much, Raluca. I hope you can all hear me. Tell me if you can't, Raluca. What the
Everything's
idea I
okay.
had when great. Well, the idea I had when writing this was that one of the main values of making Arthurian literature an investigative category is that its long extent across time gives us a chance to look at change produced by successive writers' engagement with the material. And this lecture reflects on one element in that long-term engagement, how post-medieval writers from Spencer to Ishiguro have used Arthurian reference to negotiate the matter of war. Reading post-medieval Arthurian literature for its take on war tells a story, I think, not of a timeless military legend, a man with a big sword, nor of the decline and revival of an original ideal, but of continual contestation and transformation brought about by the friction of Arthurian material with new cultural and historical developments, including the experience of wars themselves. So to begin, of course, in medieval Britain, warfare and armed combat supplied the chief subject of Arthurian literature. Even a skeptic like William of Malmesbury, who rejected the wild tales told of Arthur, accepted as reliable history that Arthur had personally killed 900 invading Saxons at the Battle of Mount Badon. And then in the medieval Romance tradition, where adventures are largely set in peacetime, prowess in arms remains an essential currency. And then after the English Reformation in the 16th century, which was a big turning point, of course, in literary history as well, despite attacks on chivalric romances on moral or theological grounds, and they, of course, were nothing new, former medieval Arthurian narratives remained popular, and the literary prestige of chivalry continued also as an ideology justifying rank and precedence. Yet at the same time, both the need and the ability to believe in a historical Arthur lessened. Because on the one hand, chivalric romance didn't need a specifically Arthurian ambience to fulfill its ends. And on the other hand, Arthur's career became harder to present as true and authorised in the way Mallory had done, nor is so vital to the whole idea of this realm that Mallory sees as connecting his time with Arthur's. That turn was by no means steady or universal. Arthur was still invoked in genealogies, in royal ceremonial and political gambits, but in general, sympathy with the medieval legend decreased. Now, look, this is where I need to change the slide. No.
At
I
the
just
bottom,
need to change
the arrow. Yes, the arrow at the bottom.
Good.
I can do
This
it. I've done it.
This took a long time. Oh, good, thanks. I'll just tell you then when to change the slide. So
Okay.
in the 1560s, for example, Roger Ascham wrote about certain books of chivalry, but pastime and pleasure, which as some say were made in monasteries by idle monks or wanton canons, as one, for example, Mort Arthur. I think it would have surprised Mallory a lot to be called an idle monk. And then by 1670, John Milton, who gave all of Arthur's battles according to Nennius, as is in his History of England, wrote that he who can accept of legends for good story may quickly swell a volume with trash. And I think legends is a pointed term here. Arthur's and his wars are tainted with England's past Catholic credulity, and so to be distinguished from truth. So Arthurian reference continued to be a way about thinking about the right to power and the right use of power, as it had been in the medieval period. But now it mainly did so outside the realm of history and with much less respect for its past origins. To be asserted as valuable, it had to be consciously remade. And in that respect, I think a recognisably modern English Arthurianism begins long before the medieval revival of the second half of the 18th century and continues to this day. Over the same period, there were also traditional factors at work that permitted the promotion of Arthur as a warrior in symbolic mode. One of these was the tendency to associate moral righteousness and fortitude, persistence in any good cause with the idea of battle, the good fight, as Paul says, The complementary tendency was to read actual wars as moral struggles between right and wrong, good and evil. And the third associated factor was the understanding of national victories and defeats in war as providentially directed, the will of God. So in long-term British historical consciousness, war history often became a form of moral and religious allegory in which victorious past leaders were very likely to be claimed as ancestors and national avatars. So, and when this tendency can't be indulged by application to historical fact, as with, for example, Henry IV, it's always likely to emerge in more symbolic forms. So, interestingly, I think, despite Protestant antipathy to later medieval Catholicism, Spencer can take Arthur out of medieval literature as the type of magnificence, the virtue that encompasses and perfects all virtues. And he explains that Arthur's antiquity, I need a new slide here, makes him all the more suitable for a work where the teaching of moral virtues is coloured with an historical fiction. Are we able to change the slide, Raluca? Partly because he was furthest from the danger of envy and suspicion of present times. But despite this careful historical distancing, readers learn, however, that Arthur's arms and armour, including his blindingly bright, impregnable diamond shield, are now in fairyland, a version of England, where yet it may be seen, if sought. So Arthur's virtues and God's support for his actions can be claimed for an ideal version of the present nation. This is all very different from Mallory, of course, even though Spencer evidently knew Mallory's work. Mallory accepts that war is business. He writes as a kind of historian. Good men will die on both sides in war. Brave enemies deserve respect, and there's not that much emphasis on victory or defeat as coming from the will of God. Wars have complex causality and consequences. They're not archetypal struggles between right and wrong. Prince Arthur, however, is much more involved in that kind of combat. It's been said by Stephen Knight and Rob Gossage that Spencer's Arthur being an ideal is written out of history. I think Spencer's also writing Arthur back into history by different means. Since the British prince, as he calls him, only ever fights the enemies of good, traitors, tyrants, infidels, papists, and so on, then all opponents of right British justice, British policy, and its true religion are shown to be evil. But the combats are not merely morally justified, they represent a matter of, they're not just individually morally justified, they are a matter of an idealised English ruling class licensed by heaven's high decree, as Spencer says, to destroy all opposition by force as a matter of justice, the justice to which the fifth book of the poem is devoted. I think Spencer's work shows how the freeing of Arthur from the medieval written record actually helped him, made him a more acceptable and adaptable subject for literary treatment, and it also removed him from under the late medieval shadow of his great knights. Arthur became the main narrative figure as avatar of the nation. However, in their new symbolic form, as Milton realised, Arthur's fights were unsuitable for detailed epic treatment, and that's why Richard Blackmore's Prince Arthur is such a poor work, because there's no point, given his allegorical good versus evil plot, in having all the epic detail of battle. Spencer always kept Arthur's fights into romance-style single combats, not as part of an army. But what happened was that I think other different modes were opened up for Arthur beyond the allegorical. And a good example that maybe I'll show next on the slide is Henry Purcell's and John Dryden's 1691 opera King Arthur, or The British Worthy. So this is ostensibly a work about war. The king's battles against the Saxons provide the narrative framework and the touches of period colour. There's another slide here, Raluca. But And the opera's concluding pageant ends with a warlike consort of valiant Britons, where the figure of honour invokes St George, the Order of the Garter, and our Sovereign High in awful state, the Sovereign High being William of Orange, who was very recently, 3 years before, defeated James II at the Battle of the Boyne. But Arthur's final speech, interestingly, from Dryden, reveals that selective propaganda by Merlin, not the full truth. Wisely you have, whate'er will please, revealed. What would displease, as wisely have concealed. Triumphs of war and peace at full ye show, but swiftly turn the pages of our woe. And Dryden here, I think, is hinting at his own need to please the monarch. His libretto, however, unlike Merlin's pageant, gestures towards his suppression of the sorrows of Arthurian tradition, Guinevere's infidelity, the king's eventual death in civil war, and the eventual defeat of the Britons. And another slide, please. Dryden's Merlin also suppresses one feature of war that the opera has already exposed, its economic and mercantile motives. So we get in the opening scene where the Saxons are defeated, the gods from above the mad labour behold and pity mankind that will perish for gold. The victorious Britons are described like fortunate traders, triumphant with spoils of the vanquished invaders. This is a war, it seems, for mercantile motives. And also there's huge emphasis on winter and renewed warmth in the poem. The 1680s contains some of the worst, harshest winters in English history. And so there's a huge emphasis on the renewing warmth of summer and of sex, more than the heat of battle. The shepherds sing, when we die, 'tis in each other's arms. And the supreme ruler of this, really, Arthur, it's Cupid. Arthur, of course, is madly in love with somebody. As Winter sings to Cupid, great love, eldest of the gods art thou, human nature is thy creature, everywhere thou art obeyed. And at the end, Venus's aria, Fairest Isle, alters the long tradition derived from Geoffrey of Monmouth, in which British women reward men's bravery in arms with love. Rather, in her version, the women excel in beauty and the men are renowned for love. But more than anything, to me, the work seems a political enticement to cherish the benefits and the pleasures of peace. Once Arthur's post-historical, then the idea that his power is based on grand moral virtue can easily attract suspicion and set itself up for critique, perhaps especially because of the earthly passion and violence still known to inform the older tradition. The king and his wars, for whom so much greatness is claimed, but on such shaky evidence, can well seem essentially theatrical figures, too slight to maintain their reputation. And I think this is what happens in Henry Fielding's The Tragedy of Tragedies in 1731, which is the next slide, please. It's set in Arthur's court. It makes a running gag of the Tom Thumb's, he's the greatest knight, his tiny size in relation to the giants that he has conquered and the great love he inspires. The dialogue repeatedly suggests that the defeated giants that has been overcome by Arthur's forces in war are in fact imaginary creatures of propaganda. The king says, "But say, my boy, where didst thou leave the giants? My liege, without the castle gates they stand, the castle gates too slow for their admittance. What look they like? Like nothing but themselves. Enough! The vast idea fills my soul. I see them, yes. I see them now before me, the monstrous, ugly, barbarous sons of whores." We don't actually see them at all, except one giantess who's described to being a lot smaller than all the other giants. And the play's tragic catastrophe, which occurs after Tom is eaten by a cow, brings out Arthur's arbitrariness and the arbitrariness of an absolute rule. like his, shut up again the prisons, bid my treasurer not give 3 farthings out, hang all the comforts, guilty or not, no matter. It looks like that this work is designed to be a satiric denial of the association of would-be autocratic regimes like this Arthur's with Spencerian magnanimity and justice. If we look at Dryden and Purcell and then Fielding, I think you can see how playful, comic and satiric treatments of Arthur can offer a new and serious slant on warfare. So instead of regarding these treatments as a kind of sign that the continuing legend's status has been lowered, I would say no. Look again at their interesting and critical engagement with the key Arthurian themes of war and state power. So what happened in the 18th century? The fortunes of Arthur at war. Roger Simpson, who's written so well on this, observed that developing interest in the Middle Ages often accomplished little for Arthur's historical tradition. I think that's right. What happened instead, I would say, is that the 18th century medieval revival was a realignment of aesthetic and emotional attitudes to the Middle Ages, including the Arthurian, through a recovery of earlier literature. The change of attitude allowed for a different estimate of medieval poetic fictions and their makers. And there's a kind of ambivalence about this in Percy's work. His preface to the relics of ancient English poetry, and that's the next slide, sorry. He apologizes for what he calls the rudeness of the more obsolete poems, but when imagining the minstrel culture from which the relics have come, he takes a higher tone and he specifically references war in order to do that. So long as the spirit of chivalry subsisted, they, minstrels, were protected and caressed because their songs tended to do honour to the ruling passion of the times and to encourage and foment a martial spirit. So you've got someone like Percy who's discrediting what he calls the fabulous chronicles of Geoffrey of Monmouth, but believing that these 6 ballads, Arthurian ballads, amongst many that he prints, put him in touch with the medieval spirit. Perhaps especially because these works are considered rude, they seem to provide imaginative and emotional engagement with the outlook of an actual past. Now, the literature itself has become what's importantly historical, as giving an idea of medieval times. Thomas Warton, I think, is really interesting in this respect. Sorry, Raluca, that's the next slide. So he's 1728 to 1790, who's closely involved with Percy's project. He centres his own Arthurian poems on relics of another kind, the Round Table at Winchester and Arthur's Glastonbury. In both cases, the physical remains come encased in layers of Warton's fiction. The table is in reality a later 13th century object repainted in the time of Henry VIII, but it's associated by Warton with ancient Britain and made a cipher for the earliest Arthurian traditions. It is old Arthur's board, the pride of warlike years, a druid frame joined with magic skill and many a rhyme, on which some British pen has sketched the names renowned. And that move is then suddenly given different emphases. The Round Table's very antiquity makes it obsolete, unhonoured, rather than revered. The British characters have faded from it. Its cultural function, Warton says, has been assumed by Spencer's page, where the great Arthurian names live unconscious of decay. In fact, in the fairy Queen Arthur is prominent. It's a figure who appears in every book. But the Round Table motif and the famous Knights of the Round Table are not at all prominent. And I think the point here is that the progress of English literature that Warton is referring to has transformed the superannuated Arthur of medieval times, allowing him to retain cultural relevance. Arthur's been brought up to date. The poem on Warton's poem on Arthur's tomb at Glastonbury is equally artful. That's the next slide, thank you. The story is taken from Giraldus Cambrensis, and it hinges on rival bardic traditions of Arthur's death, as supposedly related to Henry II when he's on his way through Wales to subdue what Warton calls Irish rebellion. One group of bards relates the story of Arthur's mysterious removal from his last battle by an elfin queen to a remote island, from where he remains ready to return. Another bard tells a different story. Not from fairy realms I lead bright-robed tradition to relate in forged colours Arthur's fate. He's going to tell truth, not boastful fiction. In this alternative version, Arthur's companions simply carry him after death to the monastery at Avalon, where he's buried. The bard relates the exact location of the grave. So imaginatively seized by this news, Arthur's going to go on to tame the Irish, and all the while yearning to get back to England to ope from its tremendous gloom the shadows of the wondrous tomb. As in Spencer, the right legacy of the Arthurian story is to inspire a realization of its meaning in modern action, involving, interestingly, in both cases, wars against Irish rebels. By this means, Arthur, though acknowledged as dead, lives on. The poem enacts Warton's view, and this is the next slide. Oh no, it's the same slide, sorry. As a literary historian, that the tale of King's abduction to Avalon and future return is exotic, not a British native. It is found in the compositions of the Welsh bards only, who flourished after the native vein of British fabling had been tinctured by these fairy tales which the Arabians had propagated in Armorica. This is not fundamentally a matter of judging historical fact for Warton, I think. He's not demanding literal assent to the tale of the tomb. Rather, he's discriminating between different kinds of Arthurian legacy in order to find the right prompts and the symbolic justifications for the actions of British posterity. That, of course, this rediscovery of the chivalric age, which was increasingly naturalized in the later 18th and early 19th century, was matched by comic and satiric impulses which wanted to represent Arthurian legends as decidedly anti-chivalric. And the next slide, it shows us the misfortunes of Elphin, 1829, by Thomas Love Peacock, brilliant satire. What Peacock does is to adapt old Welsh stories and poetry to satirise grand notions of war and kingship. The powerful took all they could from their subjects and neighbours and called something or other sacred and glorious when they wanted the people to fight for them. And the stories of minor Welsh kings are lazy and irresponsible, rapacious, but at least they're honest about it. The real target of Peacock's liberal atheism is the hypocrisy of his own England. They, the ancient Welsh, lacked some of our light to enable them to perceive that the act of coming in great multitudes with fire and sword to the remote dwellings of peaceable men, with the premeditated design of cutting their throats, ravishing their wives and daughters, killing their children, and appropriating their worldly goods, belongs not to the department of murder and robbery, but to that of legitimate war, of which all the practitioners are gentlemen and entitled to be treated like gentlemen. So that it isn't just the nature of war that Peacock is attacking here, but also the notion that the adoption of chivalry as a mark of a new kind of gentility, which was happening in the 18th and later 18th and early 19th century. That's also a total delusion. People who do these kinds of things are not gentlemen. There's a kind of an opposition here to the kind of gentlemanly chivalry that at its best Walter Scott outlines in his essay on chivalry, say in 1817. In the story's conclusion, it's very pragmatic. Taliesin brokers a deal in which Melwas, who's stolen Guinevere, avoids Arthur's punishment by returning her and joining his fight against the Saxons. The The tale ends in temporary concord. Rather than another battle, Arthur arranges a bardic contest, and he judges Taliesin's poem about justice greater than Aneurin's song of victory in war. The onset of peace allows the story's few socially useful characters to get on with their lives. War is nothing but an interruption to what people should better be doing. This kind of rationalist, unheroic vision of Arthur that Peacock puts forward gives some idea why Tennyson would initially represent his own Arthurian enthusiasm as outmoded. And this is the next slide, please, Raluca. Tennyson raised the question, why take the style of these heroic times? For nature brings not back the mastodon, nor we those times. As a framing strategy, this cleverly changed the cultural conversation about Arthur, I think. Instead of treating the king as a venerable survivor from British antiquity with a famous reputation to maintain, Tennyson began with him as a fading, archaic legend. Of course, he began with Mort Arthur, commenced 1834 to 35, which is related to the death of his great friend, Arthur Hallam, at this time. From beginning to end of Idols of the King, Arthur's memorials are tenuous. He's a phantom king, now looming and now lost. That grey king whose name a ghost streams like a cloud, man-shaped from mountain peak. With his mysterious coming and passing, Arthur is man-shaped in that he succeeds only when believed in and loyally followed. The reader's given a crucial role in upholding his regime through intuiting the kind of belief that is required, steadfast moral idealism. And Tennyson's treatment of Arthur's early wars closely follows that pattern. In The Coming of Arthur, the victories are bloodless, semi-symbolic affairs attended by lightnings and great thunders. They're empowered by a secret word from God. And individually, his knights' adventures play out their success or failure in conquering moral challenges. As a group, they reflect the connection of loyalty to Arthur's vision with military success. The prospect really then would be of a never-ending series of imperial conquests, resumed in the poem's closing reference to our ocean empire with her boundless homes for ever-broadening England. I think what saves the poem from this, I think, rather dulling tendency is that war is shown in a different light in the final poem. With his eyes now open to what's been going on in what Tennyson calls a blind haze of grief, doubting his heavenly mission, Arthur grows in human interest. And simultaneously, the last dim, weird battle of the West introduces for the first time in the poem an expression of war as unredeemed collective violence. And this is partly, but not wholly, a contrast between good war waged against national enemies and bad civil war. More simply, it's what war looks like when stripped of the notional justification of some higher good. When the death-white mist clears the battlefield, it's almost like the smoke clearing from the recoil, from the discharge of the cannons. The scene reveals no opportunity for moral or religious discrimination. No man was moving there, nor any cry of Christian heard thereon, nor yet of heathen. Only the one wave breaking among dead faces, to and fro swaying the helpless hands. I think that Tennyson challenges the sanitised militarism of The Coming of Arthur here. The imaginary of warfare, which has provided the poem's main expression of support for Arthur's right to rule, now seems to undermine it, to oppose it. Tennyson had such widespread influence that later Arthurian writers often represented their works as either supplements to him or revisionist versions of him or of Mallory, whom he helped return to popularity. in the 19th century. These writers very often claim to tell the real story behind the official legend, but as Morris Lacey has remarked, the supposed continuing legend of Arthurian war has in fact been widely various, as I'll try to show in the rest of the talk. It's often been said that the Great War made a huge difference to the imagination of war and did away with notions of war as chivalric. Not entirely true, because Tennyson continued to be a standard well after the First War. He was in my school reader when I was a kid in Melbourne, for example. Also, many of the books that have been written, popular books written before the First World War, were reprinted well into the 1930s and even later. But Great War propaganda and commemorations, though they used a lot of chivalric imagery, as been shown, they had limited specific use for Arthurian material. David Jones is in parenthesis, I suppose the next slide, please, the greatest work of this kind. And while he includes Arthurian reference, and he knew Arthurian texts very well, the citations are sporadic and uncertainly directed. They're only one element in a welter of physical and mental impressions centered in the protagonist, who's very much a private soldier, not a war leader. It's one thing that Arthurian war has happened to Arthurian war after the First World War was a way of thinking about it as how it was felt by the common soldier or by the non-combatant, not necessarily by the leader in terms of a campaign. So we have a long cultural history invoked, and mixed with the landscape of the trenches, I was the spear in Balin's hand that made waste King Pellam's land. Rather than elevate war through legendary or romance archetypes, Jones tends to read the immediate present back into the legendary past without any clear differentiation between them. So, for example, an incident between Culick and Olwen, from Culick and Olwen, is subsumed within the description of a trench collapsing in a bombardment. They say that when the boar Troth broke the land, who in his going by destroyed indifferently men and animals. The ingenious Menu, despite his craft, was a sick man all his life after, because of the poisons loosed. The two auxiliaries who were swift and useful were not seen again after that passage, when the quiet came again with a sudden sensation. In the tension silence afterwards, you couldn't find a rag of them, only someone complaining under a broken, revetting frame. No overarching mythos of war here, no heroic human agency, simpler feeling of kindred with the past through shared suffering. Jones's common soldiers assert continuing humanity within their overpowering context, which, as he says, is disproportionate in its violence, considering the fragility of us. This is the opposite of the idea of the sword of power being wielded to good use. This is the effect of war on fragile beings. I have to leave out T.H. White, partly because he's so well known, partly for lack of time. He based his work on Malory, and he put Camelot at its centre. But his English counterparts, who are less well known, often tended to do otherwise. So, for example, in his poetic sequences, Charles Williams, the next slide, sets Arthur's reign within a vast project, which he calls the expectation of the return of our Lord by means of the Grail, of the establishment of the kingdom of Logres, or Britain, to this end. In reaction against Tennyson, in particular, Williams gives the Grail absolute primacy over Arthur's own career. The great victory over the Saxons at Mount Badon is worked not through Arthur, but principally through Taliesin, a poet figure who blends Druidic knowledge with the Christian theology of Byzantium. He gives Arthur's troops a Roman capacity for civilized single command, as embodied by Virgil's Aeneid, against Saxon barbarism. Civilized centuries away, the Roman moved. Taliesin saw the flash of his style dash at the wax. He saw the hexameter spring and the king's sword swing. He saw in the long field the point where the pirate chaos might suddenly yield the place for the law of grace to strike. Arthur triumphs here through grace, not his own works. His failure to grasp that distinction means the failure of the realm to remain a fit place for Christ's second bodily coming. Galahad's quest has to be accomplished at Carbonek, not in Logres, which becomes simply Britain. And the other thing that happens in the text is that earthly chronology and individual human agency are dwarfed by a sense that all times and places intercommunicate, and historical experience continually attests to broader divine patterns of meaning beyond immediate cognition. So Arthur's misbelief that Logres is made for him, not for the Grail, is linked by Williams to the dolorous blow that brings about the wasteland, to the end of Camelot in civil war, and the fall of the Christian East to Islam. Arthur is a much smaller part of a much bigger story. And equally, despite Arthur's failure, human communion with the divine can still occur, and is what matters most, quite independently of Arthur. The creative force vested in Taliesin lives on. And similarly, and this is the next slide, though in a very different mode, John Cooper Powys's long novel, Poreus, which I've just read actually, written in 1950, set in CE 499, it engulfs an account of Arthur's wars against the Saxons within the interactions of a vast system of life forces of all kinds: environmental, ethnocultural, sexual, spiritual, psychological. These are what make up the book's strongest concerns. Arthur is very briefly observed. He's a compelling Caesar-like figure. But as quite often happens in modern Arthurianism, Merlin is a character more suited to embody the deeper workings of a story. The mood is generally closer to Geoffrey's Vita Merlini than to his Historia. Arthur's role has been diminished as the canvas grows wider around him. What's tended to happen since the Second World War was that Tennyson's high medieval version of Camelot became outmoded. The sort of grand imperial English Arthur changed to a simpler British leader of the 5th and 6th centuries, rousing his countrymen to resist Saxon invasion. And this suited Britain's new place in the world, and a Cold War sense that we must band together to fight for freedom, and so on. And new framings of the story through different character perspectives became very common, through Guinevere and Lancelot, even through Mordred in Mary Stuart's work. And the legend became subject to approaches raising questions of class, gender, sexuality, ethnicity. All these treatments have tended to relativize the significance of contemporary British Arthurian writing, making of it a set of situated narratives rather than the common national heritage that it's somehow supposed to be. And it's also, with few exceptions, unidealistic about war. Dark Age Arthurianism, whether it buys into an idea of early British history or early legend, or into later medieval literature, supposes a world in which fighting is simply a constant necessity. And I'll finish with what I think is the most striking Arthurian narrative of recent times, and that's Kazuo Ishiguro's The Buried Giant from 2015. It too has a Dark Age setting, but with elements of fantasy. As the next slide, please, Raluca, such as ogres and a dragon, and apparently anachronistic touches, including the presence of an elderly Sir Gawain, who seems to stand for the good values normally associated with a later Camelot. Ishiguro challenges the authenticity of these values in various ways. One, by refusing to make the Britons simply the right side of ethnic and religious conflict between Briton and Saxon. And secondly, he refuses to present warfare mainly in terms of delimited battles between combatants. Warfare is not a matter of men fighting it out with swords. We gradually learn that Arthur, who is said to have united this country by winning the war and ruled with wisdom and justice, conducted massacres of Saxon male children. Ishiguro may be thinking of Arthur's Herod-like massacre of children in Mallory in the hopes of killing Mordred. Gawain was complicit in those things and has been given the task of hiding the truth. The idea that Arthur has brought peace to the land is therefore shown to depend upon a fragile ability to forget or to condone the history of his atrocities. Gawain says, God may not have smiled at us, but we cleansed the land of war. And this is one of several narrative reminders in the text of modern ethnic cleansing, as in 1990s Kosovo. The buried giant of the title is in one aspect the violence latent in a populace already traumatized by violence. When soon he rises, as surely he will, men will burn their neighbours' houses by night. And Arthur's very fame is an incitement to more war. He's to many the hated Arthur. So in attacking the tradition that sees Arthur as an archetypal warrior bringing freedom to his land, Ishiguro attacks the broader notion that war brings about peace, with wide applicability to the contemporary world scene. The narrative situations created through the novel are anything but peaceful, though they are rarely overtly violent. They are characterized by a vague but deep sense of impending menace or half-forgotten trauma, the mark of a repressed history of wrongs for which the official legend of Arthur is operating as a false screen memory. So Arthurian stands here for the misleading notion, redolent of the Second Gulf War, that with the military mission accomplished, peace and prosperity will naturally assert themselves in the reign of freedom. I think that the buried giant really stands out as a very important Arthurian work of our time, but it's only one recent example of, I think, a continuously controversial nature of the Arthurian legend when it's made a medium for thinking and feeling about war. The literary lineage of Arthurian war is one of action and reaction, of a persistent contestation in which the venerable is also the vulnerable. Arthur supposedly, in theory, stands for just war, the sword of power in the right hands. But treatments of this theme change through the unpredictable outcomes of its friction with changing cultural and historical contexts. In theory, Arthur's wars uphold a conservative myth of power, but in actual literary performances, they've offered a messy, hybrid and conflicted kind of legacy to modernity. I would go so far as to say that there is no stable tradition of English Arthurian war writing. That, in my view, is a main source of this literature's continuing ability to provoke the attention of succeeding eras and to remain connected to the lived experience and imagination of war. Thanks.